Hello, everybody. I am B. Ruby Rich. I am the editor of Film Quarterly and am really thrilled to be part of this event today and to have been part of our original coverage in the journal in our summer issue. That's, if we were on the stands, would be on the stands now, with a wonderful piece by the panelist who's going to be kicking off our conversation today, Angela Aguayo, who has written a wonderful essay entitled Documentary Resistance as Collective Political Agency. And I am not doing long introductions on people. Here is the issue. Oh, I know it doesn't show up with my virtual background, but if you could see it, you would see that Angela is an associate professor of cinema and digital culture at Southern Illinois University, back in the state where I started my whole career, from Chicago, and has written a book that Oxford University published entitled Documentary Resistance, Social Change, and Participatory Media. And of course, We Tell, the program that we are celebrating and commemorating and diving deeper into today, is very much an example of that, as curated by Louis Massiah and Patty Zimmerman, out of the base of Scribe Video Center in Philadelphia, which of course has been a part of this movement almost from the beginning. So we've got a great range of people here. Also, many of us have selected backgrounds to speak to this moment, and I thought I would signal my own past in Chicago by choosing Hartemquin's Chicago Maternity Center that came out, I think, in 1976. And I was very much in Chicago. In fact, that was the year of the the US bicentennial, which was being celebrated all over the country, not with films like Chicago Maternity Center Story, but instead with retrospectives of John Ford, retrospectives of the Western, and I talked the Chicago Tribune into financing my commemoration of the bicentennial, a huge 10-day retrospective of revolutionary cinema at the Film Center where I was working at the time at the Art Institute of Chicago. So this is a great throwback for me, but it's not just a throwback. This is an opportunity for everyone to reflect on the early years and bring it all up to the present at the moment of crisis that we're all in now. So I welcome you all. Everybody has picked backgrounds insofar as their technology allows or doesn't allow, and so we'll be hearing from that. Let me fill you in on the structure. We're going to have everybody speak for 5 minutes at the beginning, somewhat off the cuff, about their own intersection with this spirit of We Tell, 50 years of participatory community media, and their thoughts about these histories and our current moment. And we've got different generations represented here, which is thrilling, and I'm sure represented out there with all of you tuning in as well. So feel free to post in the chat as we go along. We'll try to keep an eye on that, and I will try to harvest some of that for our ongoing conversation. So let me start. Angela, I've sort of introduced you already. Let me throw this over to you and let you begin the conversation. Angela Aguayo.
Hi. Well, I just want to thank Ruby and the staff of Film Quarterly for putting and featuring this article so that we can center a really important conversation. Not only is it important historically, but I think it's really important to our current moment. I came into making production as a young person, right as digital was switching, right as media production was switching over from film to digital. And so I had this firsthand view of how the digital radically transformed our environment in very unique ways. But I also understand, coming to this problem both as someone who makes media and someone who studies it. And so I'm primarily interested in community media as a cultural and political force. So in the words of film theorist, Jane Gaines, what makes someone do something instead of nothing about what they see on the screen? And So the power of community media at this particular moment is rather unprecedented. And there's a lot of reasons for that. In moments of political unrest, community media experiences incredible amount of proliferation. And the reason for that is that community media is a form of survival. People come to the camera recording their circumstances because they experience a very, very little access to the political process and very little representation to their experience on the political stage. So in moments of crisis, you get a lot of community media. And now that we're experiencing exacerbated inequity because of the pandemic, and we're getting challenges to structural racism with the push of a button, we're seeing the power of community media in this moment as something quite extraordinary. But community media has also been something that has had two other qualities at its core, which is co-collaboration, this commitment to making media with people and foregrounding the struggles of the most unheard in the process of media production. And so while mobile recording and other sorts of things have made community media more accessible and visible, the heart of community media, which is about people struggling to make their conditions better, has existed for over a century. Actually existed since the early forms of cinema were created. So, I'm interested in kind of thinking through what are the impacts and the different ways in which that happens. And what that I think demands of this current moment is to actually not only rethink how we study and understand community media. In the traditions of film and media studies, we often foreground the film text or auteurism, like the creation of one vision, where community media actually butts up against all of that and challenges those ideas with the notion of co-authorship and shared and collaborative vision. And so I think that's what makes community media powerful and potent. But as we step back and talk about the details of this history, the thing that I want to kind of put in everyone's head is like, how is the way we are changing the way we engage in politics being impacted by the documentary camera, and how community media is fueling that surge. Thank you.
Mute myself. I'll get better. Hey there. Really a pleasure. Thank you so much, Angela, for getting us started. That's a perfect introduction and set of concerns and questions. And I now want to move to introducing Louis Massiah and Patty Zimmerman, who put this program together and have really spearheaded this project. So shall I start with Louis, who is not just the founding father of Scribe, but very unusual for anyone who founds an organization, has actually stuck with it and continued to guide it and energize it and fill its ranks over the years in a wonderfully impressive and powerful way, while still continuing his work as a filmmaker and as a real force in the field. So, Louis, I think we want to start hearing about WeTell, and I'll leave that to you to start letting us know what WeTell is and why we're paying attention to it and why you wanted to put it together. Over to you, sir.
Great, thank you so much. And I really want to first thank Angela Aguayo for your writing and analysis. So oftentimes when you're involved in a project without that much time for introspection, it's such a gift and a privilege to have someone who's so thoughtful and examine the work. And Ruby Rich and your colleagues at Film Quarterly, thank you for creating the space in print, online, and now in Zoom to discuss cinema in a holistic way with the largest lens, how it affects our perspectives, our thinking, and our lives. Yeah, I'm really pleased to be in dialogue with my compadres and comadres, specifically the co-programmer of the project, Patty Zimmerman, and also compadre archivist Carmel Curtis, who also worked in shaping We Tell, and also the fellow laborers in the vineyards of community media making, Maggie Bowman, Darcy McKinnon, and Spencer Nakasako. So we'll hear more from them in a bit, but I'm really happy to be with all of you. The origins of We Tell, this collection of films that span from 1967 to 2018, came from a desire to share a set of extraordinary works and also to recognize the power that comes from media production methods that prioritize giving authorship to the subject of the films. I am impressed how these films have played important roles in strengthening and empowering diverse, down-pressed communities and want to share that wonder. So this idea of subject as author is really kind of central to participatory media. So this power, I think, in the participatory mode is witnessed in at least two places. The first really is the narratives and analysis that come out of lived experience. This is something shared with the audience, and narrative is really a nice way to say that it's how we make sense of the world. So allowing the subjects to make sense of their own world. And power also comes from the documentary process itself. The impact of makers coming up with a thesis or a narrative, and all those decisions, oftentimes with participatory community media, come about collectively. So the finished film is an articulation of that understanding. So the power in the process of creating, and so the power is in the process of creating and also in the work itself. These media works usually, as Angela talked about, usually come from some very, very specific social or political utility. These works were not made as commodities for the entertainment or, for that matter, the corporate journalism markets. Rather, these creative works were often parts of campaigns and movements. So in the realm of documentary film, participatory community media, though influential, because it was not made for markets, was not valued as such, and in some ways, I think part of the desire in We Tell is really recognizing this really undervalued, in terms of the market, body of work. And just going back to this idea of down-pressed communities, so becoming fluent in really learning about this language of documentary making in really also has a role in sort of democratic formations and democratic functioning, but we'll talk a bit more about that, I guess. One of the things that I became very aware of working at Scribe, and a large part of the work that comes out of Scribe is defined by using participatory methodologies. Again, the subjects of the films having authorships, is that the documentary process itself, and it really is part of that power, because making a documentary is really about a nexus of decisions, from everything from what is the subject, the framing, what goes in, what goes out, and there's just these countless numbers of decisions. And so when a community group is working collectively or in making a film, they're really developing an analysis, a shared analysis, and having that shared analysis gives them power. And the community represents its own interests to itself, but it also becomes a valuable thing for the outside community, those outside, to learn about how those issues affect that community. So that process then becomes valuable to the broader public in that we then are making decisions or understandings about that community based on how the community articulates what's important to them. And then we make political decisions about policies and politicians based on what what the community says is important. The process really, of WeTell really goes back, I guess, to maybe 2000. Patty will have to correct me, but I think it goes back to maybe we started maybe in 2014 or something around there. But really in 2016, after the election, after the last presidential election, it really became absolutely essential. And I think part of it was a sense that there was a failure in mass media because the perspectives of community perspectives were not part of the discourse, and that the discourse was being totally defined by these market forces that were obsessing on personality and caricature, whether it's the hero or villain or the clown or the criminal, but it's still not talking about letting communities define themselves. So it really seemed like it's important that we recognize that we have created this way of working, and that it really and if there were ways to kind of rekindle, reawaken sort of people's understanding of that this exists, that it's something that we could use in going forward. In 2018, there was a part of the process that was actually extraordinarily influential that I realized that I kind of in retrospect really kind of helped us kind of shape WeTell, was a gathering that we had in Philadelphia, and Darcy McKinnon from Novak, New Orleans Video Access Center was there, folks from Apple Shop in Whitesburg, Kentucky, folks from Visual Communications in LA, from Third World Newsreel, from DCTV, from Chicago Film Workshop, all folks who for decades and really for the 50 years had been involved in this work, many of them, sort of came to see where we are today and how our works could continue to be part of a civic discourse. So anyway, so that really was very much the underpinning.
Este tipo es amigo de Mona. Que este tipo es amigo de Mona. El que está hablando.
Someone is coming in there, but anyway, that was very much the underpinning of.
Yeah, Christina, help.
And
we'll see.
So anyway, so really believing in this methodology, and also believing that methodologies should be shared. I'm just reminded of the kind of the last, a segment from an essay called "The Education of a Storyteller" that Tony Kidd Bombara wrote, and about the importance of sharing knowledge. And so, to me, this knowledge of participatory community media is something that should be shared. And so, anyway, the lesson from The Education of a Storyteller is, if your friends don't know it, then you don't know it. And if you don't know that, then you don't know nothing. So it really is kind of incumbent upon us to really talk about this and share it. So that really is kind of part of the origin story of WeTell.
Great, that's wonderful, Louis. Thank you so much. And I so appreciate you bringing Tony K. Bombara into this discourse, because of course she was so important with your early work at Scribe, and with really intensifying those links between documentary and community as if there'd never been a gap at all. So I'm happy to have her spirit here with us. Thanks for that. Patty Zimmerman is up next, and Patty is, of course, co-programmer of WeTell, and she's a professor of screen studies at Ithaca College, and a longtime comrade in arms of mine, is on the editorial board of Film Quarterly, and is the author of many books, beginning way back when, writing on home movies, then on the Flaherty and history of the Flaherty seminar, and then recent books on digital media and transmedia and crossing platforms. And most of you who've been involved with documentary at all know her. So I turn this over for your 5 minutes to you, Patty, to continue the introduction to WeTell and your thoughts about it. Thanks.
Thanks so much. Being a historian, there is nothing better than being with people and leaving the archive and the dustbin. So I really want to thank Film Quarterly and B. Ruby Rich and Angela for giving some discursive and archival space to We Tell. And I particularly am honored to be here with my compadre, Louis Massiah, an old friend of many decades, Carmel, our incredible archivist, Spencer, Darcy, Maggie. Thank you all. And for the 134 people who are here, we are delighted that you can join us for this exploration. I'm going to speak as a historian on the project. And let me just start by just some periodization and some scope. This project, We Tell 50 Years of Participatory Community Media, starts in 1967, ends in the present. It features 41 projects, 36 organizations, 90 plus makers, and work from 19 states in Puerto Rico and not simply the East and West Coast. So it kind of refutes certain ideas about independent film. Right now, pandemic, protest, and the precarious economy has propelled the arts, media, and documentary sectors into new spaces, new concerns, and new dilemmas. Right now, my contention is this is a time for documentary media in all of its forms to reset, recalibrate, and also reimagine. And that entails embracing short forms of participatory community media to really explore this almost unknown, vibrant sector and this evolving open archive that We Tell is attempting to just open up just a little bit. But in order to move forward this reinvention of the forms, purposes, and use values of documentary, we also need to renew our thinking about documentary histories and their dispersed and still evolving archives, which are as equally hidden. Now, to do this, we have to rethink documentary as something that is expansive and polyphonic and plural, a very wide ecology, because embedded in that wide ecology are so many tools and tactics and strategies and forms that move beyond the text and doc as a fixed object to help us think about how to move forward in the present moment of crisis. So my question would be, how do we rethink the historiography of community media so that we can investigate and understand production, distribution, exhibition, and how can we understand community, and how can we understand what it means for a documentary to be of use? Community media tells us that documentary can be more and can expand beyond feature films for festivals and broadcast. So we need to think of documentary as a really heterogeneous, really expansive ecology and history of places, people, practices, politics, and processes. Now, this is a very vibrant sector, and it is a very diverse sector of different races, ethnicities, classes, genders, nations, identities, locations, and regions. And it includes so many organizations like Novak, Kartemkin, Scribe, Vietnamese youth, the Occupy movement, Deep Dish, Paper Tiger, Newsreel, and on and on. We can think of this work as being no budget work or micro budget work that in many ways rethinks the work of media and its vital lifeblood of being connected to political movements, ranging from the anti-war movements, Black Power, Asian American, Latinx, political struggles, environmental movements, decarceration. For 50 years, this kind of media has absolutely flourished. This, small media, modest media, micromedia has flourished. And I don't consider it flourishing in an underground way. It has flourished in communities. I see this work as being, by any technology necessary, our exhibition covers about 12 different technologies. In this work, we see a shift to the micro instead of the macro, to the collaborative and participatory instead of a more industrial model, to the many instead of the one, and from an idea of makers makers of work, makers of community, to away from ideas of authors and directors. So we need to really reanimate these histories by revisiting them, reclaiming them, and digging them out. And Carmel will talk more about how to do that. It's a very huge task. So what does this cinema of utility do? It enters into very unresolved politics to generate dialogues that are urgent and necessary, and to galvanize community connections on often very micro levels. How do they do this? Micro budgets, no budget, accessible and affordable technologies ranging from 16mm port-a-pack video, cable access, satellite, DV, mobile phones, social media, drones, on and on. This is necessary and urgent, really urgent historiographic work that raises all kinds of issues, because you can't just go to one archive and find everything. And I'll let Carmel take that on. So in this kind of history, and even we tell, can never be definitive, and it can never be complete. It needs to be carried on by those of us joining today in this webinar, and those who will follow us, and those who are younger than us. I want to end by just providing some historiographic vectors that we might consider in thinking through how we might do and think through this very urgent historiography of participatory community media, made even more urgent by the current twinning of pandemic and protest. And I want to end by just offering 7 Ps of historiography, okay? And they're just vectors, 7 Ps. 1 is polyphonic, 2 is place, 3 is people, moving from DIY to DIWO, do it with others. Politics, which are unresolved and contradictory. Process-oriented. Power, which can be reclaimed by people. And a passion for justice and equity. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patty. Appreciate that. This is already so rich. It's like, I'm very, very happy. That's all I can say. And I'm especially happy to be introducing Spencer Nakasako. We go back a little ways anyway. I think I was writing for the Village Voice back when Spencer was releasing AKA Don Bonus. And to me, it marked a thrilling new movement in documentary. And I've never had to reevaluate that first judgment. Spencer went on to make a whole trilogy of documentaries conceived in the cradle of the Tenderloin and of community media production with the youth there, and has gone on to be a guiding force in documentary ever since. He also, I just want to note for the history books, helped us found and jumpstart the SOCDoc program at University of California, Santa Cruz, that I started with Renee Tajma-Pena, who's here in the audience, shout out there, and really was instrumental in forming our whole attitude to documentary, and went on to provide the same service when he was at UC Berkeley J School. So he's not only been intervening in the field and instructing the youth back then, but all the way through, and we just all have an impossible debt to repay to you, Spencer. So coming up next, Spencer Nakasako, your stage.
Thanks for having me. I don't know, tough act to follow, Patty. You know, when you're working on every day, you don't really think about what you're doing, you just work. And so it's only at these kinds of things that you have to kind of reflect back, and it being so long ago, sometimes it's tough to remember. But the first thing I think I'd like to say is, you know, it's interesting that Louis and Patty called this We Tell, because if I look back on history, or my history, that's the basis of how I even got started making movies. I got started in the late 70s, early 80s. And back then there was pretty much zero Asian American presence in the media. There were no really well-known Asian American filmmakers. And there was nothing at the theaters, there was nothing on TV. And I was very fortunate at the time to cross paths with a number of Asian American filmmakers that were working, quote unquote, under the radar. And particularly in San Francisco, Chinatown, which was a real hotbed at the time. It was drawing a lot of attention because of civil rights and gang violence, and the poverty was being brought out into the forefront. And there was a bunch of media makers running around. And the three most influential ones for me was Lonnie Deng. She was actually at that time producing a PBS series called Bean Sprouts, which is a 5-part children's TV series. There was Curtis Choi. He was housed out of the iHotel with Kearny Street Workshop, and he was making a film called The Fall of the iHotel. And Wayne Wang was running around at that time too, making China's Missing. And so what was great about running into all these people and getting to meet them and work with them was they were all very driven, they were brash, they were angry, they had an attitude about their stories and our stories being told. And also integrating in a very organic way the community. Many of them worked with nonprofits in conjunction with nonprofits. Lonnie produced Bean Sprouts with Chinese for Affirmative Action and the Chinese Teachers Association. Curtis was, Kearny Street Workshop, which was a group of artists, was instrumental in The Fall of the iHotel. Wayne, many of the characters in China's Missing are real Chinatown characters, and they're people that he was working with at the time. And so that's my influence. You know what I'm saying? I didn't go to film school. That was my film school. And it really sort of prepared me if I wanted to jump cut to the early 90s when I got a call out of the blue from a dinky little youth center called the Vietnamese Youth Development Center. It was like 3 little offices housed in Glide Memorial. And it's post-Rodney King, and there's money that's filtering into the inner city to basically come up with programs to keep kids off the streets. And little did I know that the Vietnamese Youth Development Center had a much, much bigger vision than I ever could. I went in there thinking I was going to teach video, and they were also expecting the kids. They brought in me to teach video. They brought in a dancer to teach dance. They brought in a theater person to teach theater, and they brought in an artist to teach public art. So the kids were just basically going to be immersed all day, every day in some kind of art form. And for me, when I was first brought in, they brought me into the room and they said, "This is your room and this is your gear." The gear, there was no camera. There was a broken VCR and there was a TV that worked. And the bottom line was figure it out. I just kind of looked at those kids. At that time, there was a large group. There was 15, all Southeast Asian, all 1.5s. 1.5s means they're born basically in Southeast Asia, but they're raised in America. All refugee kids. My first impression was that this was the time in the early 90s when there was a Time magazine article about how all minorities needed to emulate Asian Americans because we were the model minority. And these kids that I was working with that first day were the total opposite of any model minority. And it was, they were loud, they were outspoken, they had something to say. And I realized also that being 1-5s, I was fortunate in terms of catching them as they were the first. They were the first in their family to go to school. They were the first to watch American TV. They were the first to eat a hamburger and hot dog. You know what I'm saying? And so being there, I realized I was in a fortunate position, which drove me to basically beg, borrow, or steal camera gear, anything I could get my hands on, technical help, whatever, to help push these kids forward and get us through that first 6 weeks. And that first 6 weeks was still to this day, one of my favorites in terms of them every one of them completing their own film that they made and produced, and all within themselves, which was actually the birth of AKA Don Bonus. But more importantly was, where I was incredibly moved, was the screening that we had after, which was purely a community screening, but nothing that I had ever witnessed before, where families and friends came out. There had to be over 100 people showing up and sort of experiencing that kind of community energy. And given that, it's like what started out was just going to be 6 weeks ended up being 17 years. And that's
Great.
that.
That is a great origin story. Thank you, Spencer, so much. It's great to have that moment brought back alive for us into our time. I want to introduce Maggie Bowman, who's going to be speaking next, who is now working with IDA, the International Documentary Association, but spent a lot of years at Potemkin, where she was involved as a producer, or a series producer on We Are Witnesses Chicago and Hard Earned. And I'm going to turn this over to you, Maggie, to get your perspective on those years and your thoughts about that now. And I just want to say we've got a lot of Potemkin folks in the house. So shout outs to, Gordon Quinn and Judy Hoffman and a bunch of other folks who've been showing up on the chat. So you got the insider audience and all of us outsiders here with you. So Maggie.
Great. Thanks so much, Ruby. And I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation. This is really an incredible, the program, I saw one evening of the We Tell program, January 16th at the University of Chicago. It was the States of Violence program. And it was a cold, bitterly cold night in Chicago, and was feeling that sort of blue Chicago winter kind of way, and was really reinvigorated and recentered about my work by the program, which was also followed by an incredible conversation with Louis and Dr. Jacqueline Stewart from University of Chicago, and Myra Kwaja, an organizer and journalist at the Invisible Institute. So it was a profound night for me, and I especially appreciate it now because it was the last public screening I went to before quarantine, and the last community dialogue. And one of the reasons why it was so profound, it did help me reconnect. I was a union organizer before I became a filmmaker, and one of the earliest campaigns I was on in Iowa City in 1998 was 2,000 nurses that were organizing. And a woman named Jenny Rohr came to help us make a campaign video that featured the voices of 30 or 40 of the nurses. And it played a role in our victory, which was still one of the most exciting things I've ever been a part of. And then years later, settle in Chicago once I've gotten into filmmaking, back in Chicago, which is where I'm from, and come to find out that Jenny was one of the original collective members at Cartemquin and the Chicago Maternity Story. She was one of the makers of that. So I think for me, finding my home as a filmmaker at Cartemquin was a place where I felt like, okay, these people understand the values of media and social change, and I've learned so much. I feel so indebted to the legacy that Gordon and Judy, Jerry Blumenthal, and others founded at Cartemquin. And it continues to be a home when I want to debate something about ethics and accountability about a piece. There's a lot of space to do that. I think what I wanted to, where my head is at today is more thinking about a recent experience a year ago with We Are Witnesses Chicago, which I co-directed with Stacey Robinson, and just thinking about some of the challenges in that project with partners we had in journalism, and the challenges that we had with living out our values of the way in which we wanted to make this series in a way that was accountable to the community and participatory with the community. And I, mentioned to Louis when we were talking about this panel, I said, I don't know if I belong on the panel because, co-authorship, that series was not co-authored. But because of the values and the way that, all Cartemquin films are made, there was a level of collaboration and mutual respect and understanding that was a part of it. One example would be the way in which all Cartemquin films would go back and share a rough cut with the folks in the film prior to it being finished, giving them an opportunity to give feedback. That doesn't sit so well with folks in mainstream journalism. And so this question of who is the steward of the story? Who has the responsibility? And there were moments in the edit when my co-director and I felt that our relationship, which we had been building up over months, and this deep trust that we had built with our subjects, wasn't being regarded as highly as it ought to be. And so but we felt partnering with these organizations, the work was going to a much wider, and they were nonprofit media organizations, the work was reaching a wider audience. But it was incredibly challenging, and something that it would give me pause with working with those partners again. So that's something that's on my mind today, as well as what parts of those ways in which I've been a part of filmmaking and which Cartemquin has been a part of filmmaking need to continue to evolve in terms of relationship to communities and accountabilities, particularly to a community that, I am not always a part of, like when it comes to the 15 different voices in We Are Witnesses, which is the series is made up of 15 short films told first person perspective of people who've had different experiences with the criminal justice system in Chicago. So those are some of the things that I'm wrestling with, and that at Getting Real, which is IDA's biennial documentary conference, which is coming up at the end of September, we'll be engaging with a number of these issues. Louis, we're really lucky to have Louis on a conversation, and there will be a number of other topics. So to me, I think that I'm really interested in the kinds of topics that come up in this conversation around community media. The larger independent media world is hungry for and needs to be in dialogue with some of the underpinnings and the way that, Patty, that you kind of listed them out, all of those P's, which I think is really helpful, and which is not necessarily part of the vernacular of indie documentary making as a whole.
Thanks so much for that. That's really opening up really rich areas. I want to introduce, coming up next, Darcy McKinnon, who is the former executive director of NOVAC, the New Orleans Video Access Center, and has tales to tell and knows those histories really, really well, and was pivotal in her time there. to really assessing and reactivating its video archive of the work that's been done over the scope of its life in New Orleans, and has now left to be an independent documentary maker, and is working on a number of different features and short film, all grounded in the social and cultural issues of New Orleans. So let me just turn it over to you, Darcy, and try to get us on track. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ruby. Hi, everyone. And all of the previous speakers were really great in framing kind of my thoughts for today. I'm a lifelong Southerner, except for a short period in the Bay Area, which I would identify as part of kind of my education around participatory media. I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area for about 4 years, during which time I did two things that really kind of framed my thinking before I knew it was doing that. One was I ran a youth media program at KDOL, which was Oakland's educational access channel, and worked with kids for a few years to create their own media. And the other was assistant editing and then eventually co-producing Maquilapolis with Vicky Funari and Sergio de la Torre, which was a film that was built in collaboration with a workers' activist collective in Tijuana. And the process of making the film in partnership with the women activists from Chilpancingo, but also the act of fighting with funders and distributors about how we could represent that relationship in the documentary space. And this is 1998, 99, having repeated conversations with ITVS and PBS if we were allowed to pay women who were creating media that was in the film. About a third of the final film is stuff that the women who were in the process shot with us, and we felt it was important to pay them for their time. And in some cases, they were giving up really vital work that they needed to do to support their families to participate in the storytelling activity. And so when I moved to New Orleans, I think I brought that with me in terms of how I wanted to engage with the community here. As a Southerner, I think one of the things that frames all of my work is an understanding of how the divides of resources are geographically different, how there are down-pressed, as Louise says, communities everywhere, but that the dearth of resources for the work is notably much larger, which we often find when we have conversations with funders who ask, like, well, why don't you go to community foundations? And we're like, yeah, no. When I took over NOVAC, I didn't really have any knowledge or interest in video archiving or preservation. We got our archive back from the University of New Orleans, where it had been on the 4th floor of the library during Katrina, which is the only reason that it still exists. And it was the funeral of one of our founding members that prompted me to connect with some of the original founders of NOVAC to start putting our archive back together. And we've built a small preservation lab and started really processing some of the video work of the first 10 years of the organization. And I was talking with Ruby beforehand. One of the things that our community-based archive really does for me is situate our organization in its own long history. We've been around for 48 years, and we're founded in the wake of Camille and Betsy, which at the time were the worst hurricanes and most devastating hurricanes to hit South Louisiana. And that coincided with the portability of video technology and a kind of late civil rights third wave, if you will, that was focusing on community access television. And those things came together to start this movement in New Orleans that resulted in NOVAC's existence. And I think of that as a really powerful way to frame what's happening in the South today. And as the industry and the independent documentary industry in particular has become more decentralized, we're able to we have a renaissance of doc makers who live and work here and who use their tools to engage with community. And to me, that's really important as a representative of a place that's a culture. We call them culture bearers here in New Orleans, where we're a seat of culture, and so much of cultural product that's in the United States has originated here, but for generations and generations it was extracted. And I think that's true of lots of places, but it was really particular in the South and And so the ability that we have to engage in community media practices that are resulting in people from New Orleans being able to be the creators and the owners of the documentation of the practices and the culture that belongs to them is really powerful, and hopefully to have benefit of that both in a political activist frame and also just to have economic access to resources because they are people who can create content. I think when I think about today, and particularly right now with the dual pandemics, I think about the work of community and participatory media. One of the kind of programs that emerged at Novak over the last 5 or so years is creating short content that's social issue oriented, that is participatory in nature. And it certainly was framed by some of the work that was done in early years with Novak. But the example that I like a lot, we did a series called Post Coastal, which is focusing on how coastal communities in Louisiana are dealing on the human level with the impacts of coastal land loss and climate change. And then that model, which has been partnering with nonprofits and community organizations to create human stories, to put a human face on climate change. We've transitioned kind of our focus over a couple years to criminal justice, and what that looks like today is really exciting. Here in New Orleans, we have an entire bunch of judgeships that are coming up, as well as a DA's race, and there is a slate of people running for office to take over effectively the criminal justice system in New Orleans. And we also recently worked with Garrett Bradley's film Time. Garrett used to work at Novak, and she's a good friend of the organization. And after kind of the film's release at Sundance, we started working with Fox and Rob Rich, who are the subjects of the film, because they wanted to take the work that is portrayed about them in Time, which is an award-winning independent film in the kind of broader documentary world or the documentary industry, and use what they learned by working with Garrett to advocate for some really local causes. So we've been helping them and basically coaching them and helping them create their own videos to advocate for clemency for Louisiana incarcerated people to get out of prison, especially at the time of COVID. So I've just been thinking a lot about the ways that the practices that were started in the 70s at Novak are influencing real activism and real community engagement today. And the last thing I just want to leave is John Goff, who is at the Flaherty Center now, did a conversation with us last year, and we were watching some William Greaves' work, and reminded us that sometimes the archive is actually far more woke and far more engaged than the limitations that we put on ourselves as doc makers now. And so to return to the work that we have in our archives, especially that participatory work, to frame the work that we're moving forward with now is really exciting to me.
Thank you so much, Darcy, and thanks for that shout out for what we might talk about in a little while. I want to move now to Carmel Curtis and invite you up here, Carmel. Carmel's now working as an archivist in the Moving Image Archive at Indiana University, and is a board member of Screen Slate, the nonprofit resource that people may know, and also a proud member of the XFR, the Transfer Collective, which is doing such vital work to increase community access to at-risk audiovisual media often from disempowered or outsider communities. So Carmel, stage is yours.
Hi everyone. Thanks so much to those of Film Quarterly for helping to put this together, and thanks of course to Louie and Patty and all the filmmakers, and Angela, thanks again for your beautiful and intelligent article. You can click on the links that are either in the chat or about to be in the chat and read all about Transfer Collective, and I encourage you to do that. Transfer Collective has done and continues to do a lot of really great work. And I see a couple of Transfer Collective and Transfer Station names in the chat. If you are currently or were a former member of Transfer and want to identify yourself and say hi in the chat, please do so. What I want to focus my 5-minute spiel on is the importance of archiving as an active, not as a passive part of media making. and particularly community media making. In the 2+ years that Transfer Collective worked on this project, and in the 10 years or so that I've been working in archives and with archival media, I see a lot of the same things. I've seen a lot of under-resourced, understaffed, underfunded, quote unquote, formal archives. By that I mean institutional archives that are in well-established, seemingly well-endowed institutions. I've seen a lot of overwhelmed individual media makers and collectives who are interested in accessing some material they made in the past and realize that they no longer have a film projector, a VCR player, or even a USB drive anymore. I've seen and personally experienced feelings of guilt, feelings of inexperience or underexperience, feelings of embarrassment that an archive or personal collection isn't in better shape. And to bring it all around, I often also see media makers or collectives who are thinking about donating their materials to formal archives and have anxiety around that because of the under-resourced, understaffed, underfunded institution, not wanting to let go of your life's work for it to be deposited in an archive to continue to just sit on a shelf. And all of this makes sense, I think, to some extent. Priorities are hardly around saving what's in the past. It's because there's so much of an urgency, as many of the people have spoken about already today. There's so much of an urgency in creating new things, especially when it's so central to survival and democracy. And institutions often don't necessarily value putting resources into archives because they too are focused on creating new things, and often new things that can bring in new money. Angela, in your article, you referenced our nation's willful amnesia. And I think participatory community media is and really has the potential to counter that amnesia. But it requires active work on the part of those involved in participatory community media. Participatory community media, Patty, you mentioned the multiplicity of that. And I think part of that includes this documentation of our expanded stories, expanded experiences, struggles, celebrations. Louis, as you say, I think that collectively is critical to democracy and the process of democracy. But if we don't put in the work to save this documentation, then the amnesia continues and repeats itself. The point that I want to really stress here is how possible, how manageable, how totally doable it is to incorporate archival practices into our acts of media making, and particularly community making. I do have a formal and very expensive degree from moving image archiving, specifically degree in moving from NYU, but it is totally doable to incorporate these archival principles and practices into your media making without having a degree. DIY, Patty, you taught me a new word, DIO, do it yourself, do it ourselves. The urgency behind community media making can relatively easily be expanded to incorporate being mindful of accessing these materials in the future and to counter this willful amnesia. Moving forward, simple things to begin all of you filmmakers out there. Simple things like standardized file and folder naming conventions, identifying and differentiating your final versions from the drafts, saving multiple copies of your work, and saving multiple copies of your work on platforms that aren't, and not saving multiple copies, not relying on platforms that don't have people's interests in mind, like Facebook and YouTube. The Internet Archive, archive.org, is a really great alternative option there. The other point that I want to make about how doable and practical and possible archiving and taking archiving into your own hands as media makers is that you don't have to do it alone. Pooling resources in the same way that many of the works that we see in the We Tell series and as we see in the expansive ecology of participatory community media is a common practice, and that can easily be extended to archiving. One of the aspects of Transfer Collective that I really love and value and appreciate is this concept of horizontal mentorship, that we each have something to learn and we each have something to teach, that there is this power and possibility in working together and collaborating. the question then becomes right now in this moment is how can we continue, how can we reinforce, how can we establish new place-based community media practices that incorporate archiving, one of the P's that Patty, two of the P's that Patty mentioned, place and people. How can we incorporate archiving into this in a time when place-based community media means something so different than it did 6 months ago? None of us have the answers to that exactly, but what I think is important and essential is we're redefining and rethinking and reshaping many of our spaces, our situations, our vocabularies. I think that there's a real opportunity and necessity to be inclusive and to educate ourselves on new skills and to reach out to people, to build the table, to have people, representatives sitting at the table of a balanced and inclusive and very intentional plan to push forward these activist demands for social change.
Sorry about that. Well, this has been quite bracing. I think we have flipped the ratio of how much we're hearing from the panelists and how much we're going to engage more informally, but it's been really, really dynamic and informative. I want to thank everybody. The chat's been lively, and I want to give a shout out to some of the people who are here. We also have some great questions that came up in the Q&A from Brian Hugh about education and how you train students differently to do this kind of documentary, and from Terry Francis, who's on our editorial board, about what the implications are for curating and how curation can accommodate this. And then we've got links being posted. Dee Dee Halleck, one of the foremothers of this kind of work, is here in the house, and that's great to see. Ariel Doherty's been bringing in the history of women make movies. We have Kara Mertes from Ford on here. We have Emiko Amori, another pioneer in this field of documentary. Deirdre Boyle, Linda Blackaby, Renee Tajma Pena is here, Vicky Funari is here. It's really, Abby Sun is here. It's really a terrific group. So I want to let the breadth and the vigor of that audience be here in this online room with us. And as we move into this new mode, I want all of you on the panel to feel free to jump in with some of these questions. And I also want to alert the audience to the chat. Hello, Lawrence Carter Long, also up on here, recent contributor, frequent contributor to Film Quarterly. And I want to invite you all to take part now in bringing this forward. What do these archives have to teach us? I'll just start with that. Angela, you said as we were beginning this conversation that the story of democracy's survival is one of participatory media. So now in this moment of being under threat, how do you all think about it? And before we end today at 2:30 Pacific time, I want to remind Louis and Patty to let people know how to access We Tell. We're getting a lot of those questions. And I know it was a touring exhibition, but now in the pandemic era, I suspect you're not sure yet what's going to happen next, but we've got an enthusiastic batch of questions asking how can people access it online? How is it going to be available? So let's keep the chat going with some of the answers to these questions, and let's hear from those of you on the panel who've been so eloquent in terms of these histories and issues that we're facing. How do we bring that up to the moment? What do you want people to know going forward? What practices do we need to revive? What practices today do we need to modify? And how can you help people think through these issues? I don't know who wants to speak first, but I'm eager to hear. And I'll help unmute you if you're stuck.
Louis, could you maybe talk about where We Tell is now?
Yeah, let's start with that.
Sure. As Maggie had mentioned, I think our last public screening was a wonderful, wonderful screening at the University of Chicago that Jacqueline Stewart had hosted us there. And it really was just a really important gathering of 6 weeks of screenings. And we unfortunately had to, because of the pandemic, we stopped. So at present, we are going back to the filmmakers, including Spencer and the folks from Novak and other folks, to see whether or not we can extend it. The National Endowment for the Arts really was the primary funder for the tour, and Ford Foundation and Independence Public Media kind of helped with a really wonderful catalog that we put out. So we're trying to figure it all out now, just in terms of budget, and but we realize that there's been a lot of interest that has for We Tell, and the reason we did it is because we really believe in this work, and as everybody has said, there's such power in the archive. There's such power in this history that so we're in the process. Scribe Video Center website, you can definitely send us a note and we'll add you to the list. But we really think by this fall, we hopefully will be able to relaunch We Tell and hopefully for online and classroom use.
Great. Angela, you started us off. Do you have anything you want to say to you've gotten some shout outs. Is there any thread you want to pick up on before we keep going?
I think that we really need, if we're talking about going back in history, I think we need to think about the political economy of community media. So, and Patty writes about this in the best way. She talks about how, like, a lot of these community media, organizations evaporated in the 80s and 90s. Their funding was gutted. There was a larger gutting of arts, culture in particular. But we really need to start thinking about advocacy, about getting these technological skills into the hands of young people earlier as part of curriculum. Schools have tons of technology and don't have the instruction on how to use or think about production as a pedagogical process. So I think there is a piece around political economy that has to do with pedagogy and funding and all kinds of other things that we really need to start revitalizing in order to kind of have more of this work kind of surfacing around in our ecosphere. So that is something I'll put out on the table is.
Great.
And if I just mention one thing, I had the fortunate ability to have access to all of these wonderful films in We Tell when I was teaching a community media class. And so I was showing my students the documentaries, the first documentaries around domestic violence, around incarceration of women in prison, all of these wonderful things. And they were just shook, because what is so potent then is so clearly important now. So I think I want to encourage Patty and Louis to continue with making this series available so that we can keep it around for our classrooms and for future learning and political action.
Great.
Ruby,
I'm just asking for everyone to be unmuted. Yes.
Ruby, I'd like to jump in. I saw a question about distribution, and I actually think this connects to a little bit about what Angela was saying. So Novak did a series called Post-Coastal, like I said, which is about coastal communities. And we really focused on short content, which is what we're trying to do because it's doable also. It's a huge part of it. I think longer content is really difficult to wrangle through the process in a truly participatory manner. But one of the things that came out of that is really rethinking what distribution needed to look like. And those works, although we definitely tried to make them at a production value, that they were festival quality, that they were going to look beautiful. But we also said, we really talked about, like, internally at the organization, who needed to see it. One of the films is called Refuge, and it's about a Cambodian immigrant, Pan Plork, who's now a successful fisherman, who's trying to decide if his whole Cambodian community in Plaquemines Parish is going to need to move in the face of rising sea levels. And another was in partnership with the United Home and Nation about the loss of sacred indigenous sites in Louisiana to sea level rise. And we ended up having some really great conversations about how to get these pieces out and who needed to see them. And one of the things we realized is that a major group of people that needed to see them were other people in Louisiana who don't live on the coast and who were going to be responsible for voting and holding legislators accountable for policies around coastal restoration and preservation. It was going to impact the life of people in southern Louisiana. So we did a tour through libraries and museums in northern Louisiana. And the other thing that we have been in negotiation with is a lot of the local news stations are now having digital streams on their SVOD providers. And so the Fox affiliate that serves South Louisiana actually needs a lot of content. And we thought, how great would it be if this kind of community media is actually going out on a Fox channel. And that's happening through a partnership with the local news station. And so I think for us, it was about thinking about distribution, which kind of just feels now like, oh, you put it on Vimeo and you walk away, or you have festival, or you enter the kind of broader distribution landscape. But in fact, the stuff we're making is about Louisiana and Louisianans. And so we needed to kind of think old school, think grassroots. We took it on tours, and then we partnered with our partner organizations like the Tribal Nation and like the organization with whom we partnered for Refuge, and let them take it on tour as well. That's another thing I learned from Vicky, who I did not know was on this call when I talked about Monkeylopolis.
Patty, yeah.
Yeah, you know, it's so gratifying that so many people want to know like what's going to happen to WeTell. And I want to sort of frame this in terms of technology and its affordances. I looked at one point, there were 139 people on this call from many different countries and time zones. And we could never have done that in an embodied way. And this is a huge audience. This is a huge audience to even talk about community media, and then for, you know, Carmel and I to talk about these labyrinthine histories we're trying to dig up. So there are affordances now that we can use, not just to get the work out, but to generate and mobilize conversations. So one point I want to make, and Darcy, I'm inspired by you and Spencer and Maggie, is it's so important for us in documentary at this historical moment of crisis. We really have to think now beyond festivals, beyond broadcast, and beyond museums. And this is a history that we can use in a dynamic way. The history of community media is a history of figuring out that power to the people means literally they get more time to talk than the film is on the screen. I've been at screenings at Scribe where the film shown was 10 or 15 minutes and there was an hour discussion. And that's the legacy that I think we can recapture, whether it is face-to-face, mask-to-mask, plexiglass to plexiglass, or on Zoom. These are all new affordances with enormous contradictions we can think through. So I think this way of thinking, not just in terms of micro budgets and short forms, but really rethinking distribution and exhibition to achieve the goals we need, which is to not be isolated on our iPhones, thinking that's the entire world, right? To think of this as a trampoline or a catapult to make connections for real political change and a real seizing of power. And I, of course, have to say, to seize power and to reclaim, you need archives, archivists, and histories, and you need to think of those as not being inert and dead, but you need to think of them as being constantly reinvented and alive and ready and waiting to be mobilized and remade in new ways.
To just kind of add to what Patty said real quick, I really think we as a community and industry need to think through what social change means and what power documentary or community media has to play in that particular process, that thinking through that problem a little bit more would be really helpful, because I think we want to avoid the tendency to represent social change and not actually intervene in it. Which is a problem of, there's a tourism problem, but also a tourism of like a visibility problem where we're just hung up on recognition and not redistribution.
Oh, I like that. Good. Maggie, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, I just wanted to pick up on both what Darcy said and Patty said. It's really exciting, Darcy, to hear about the Fox affiliate. And I think that the idea of there are existing distribution channels in our communities that if we can get more direct access to them, there's a lot of power there. And I think that what we have going for us is that we're seeing in mainstream media, you've got especially nonprofit newsrooms who are starting to put a value on community engagement and audience engagement in a way that they haven't before. And so they can value and you know, taking work into the community to have a talk back. That, you know, this was one of the really most powerful things about We Are Witnesses, was a 25 screenings at Chicago Public Library branches afterwards, which sometimes only had 10 people in them, but these robust conversations. But the challenge is when the values of those organizations who own those channels of distribution do come into conflict with the makers and the community. And so I think we're seeing a shift. We're seeing some more journalism organizations and outlets who are starting to rethink what does it mean to be an objective journalist. And there was a robust debate on Twitter this weekend between a mainstream photojournalist for the Chicago Tribune and a bunch of other community journalists who he said, do people who are activists can even consider themselves journalists in response to covering protests in Chicago? And a really robust debate followed, because I think increasingly there is a multiplicity of viewpoints in journalism about that. But these are the kinds of things we have to struggle with and negotiate and always be aware of when we are making partnerships with distribution channels such as a Fox News affiliate, or in the case, our distribution partners here in Chicago were an alt weekly newspaper, an NPR affiliate, and an Univision channel. And so those, to having to varying degrees of them being on the same page and being okay with us about our methods.
Great. Great. These are great points. We sadly are down to our last 7 or 8 minutes. So I want to let you know that, and also address some of these other questions that are coming up and your last thoughts that you may have. And I think this question we're getting to now about delivery, shall we say, about delivery mechanisms, and about how this moment is so very different from anything that this work was preparing for in its own lifetime of technology, is really pertinent. And I think it's a moment, we know that when there are these vast shifts in systems, there's disaster, but there's also opportunity for people to be able to, Stuart Hall used to say there's a moment at which outsiders get to jump through those windows quick before they close up again into walls blocking access. And I think this is one of those moments. And I think it's really great to think about how this work can be, I won't say weaponized, but can be made available and empowered to greater audiences because of this moment of technology before the corporations have figured out how to sew it all back up again. That there's this moment, I like to say that there's been a leveling of expertise. No one knows what they're talking about. No one knows what's happening next. So our voice is as important and legitimate as anyone else's. And I like to tell that to people, and I think it's something to tell ourselves at every minute. Before I open this back up now, people have been asking in the chat how to access this in the future, and we will be posting it onto the filmquarterly.org website. And Rebecca Prime, our associate editor, is going to be sending everyone everyone who signed in today that link next week when it becomes live. So stay tuned and please prepare to share it. And we're also going to continue doing these. Thank you, Patty, for that comment on the benefits of this lockdown. So the next one is going to be on September 25th. We're going to be discussing with Samantha Shepherd her new book on race and sports, and specifically Black sports. And then the next month, in October, we're going to be bringing another article back to life. Kaz Bannon and Warren Critchlow are going to be talking about their piece, the cover piece on this current issue, about Lessons of the Hour, Isaac Julian's installation on Frederick Douglass. And Isaac Julian's going to be joining us, so that's going to be in October. And we're going to try to keep these going. November, of course, is a fraught month, so we'll see what happens before and after the election. But I think definitely these voices are going to be important. They're going to be necessary. And these big convenings started 4 years ago, right after the election, in that moment of shock that followed. And a number of people who've remained active with Film Quarterly were part of that session on the aesthetics of fascism that we held at in the amphitheater of Film at Lincoln Center on a very, very fraught night at the end of November in 2016. So we want to keep this going and provide a space, and if subjects and convenings to take forward, we really want to hear them. Let us know. I've managed to use up more minutes, but we've got almost 5 minutes left. Any parting, very, very brief comments from you, our beloved panelists? You've been terrific. Any last thoughts from people who haven't had a chance to weigh back in again? Carmel, Spencer, Louis, any last thoughts?
I so admire the work of you folks, Spencer, Carmel, Darcy, Maggie, Patty, Ruby, Angela, and anyway, yeah, it means a lot. But there are two things about participatory media. There's preserving the archive is really, really key, but also there is a future, and really understanding that we have to figure out ways to make the work, to continue to create the work and make it more accessible, which that meeting in 2018 that I talked about was really about that, really looking at participatory media as we go into the 2020s.
Great, great. Yeah, Patty?
Carmel first.
Carmel,
this
great,
is
sorry.
hardly as eloquent a wrap up as Louis, but I'm stuck on these P's that you brought up, Patty, and I really think that some kind of pissing on the status quo, some kind of P needs to be incorporated into your list of P's.
Add it on. Great, Carmel. Wonderful.
Yeah, and I was going to say, Ruby, don't hesitate when you say weaponize it. Let's weaponize the archive. Let's take it out there, guns a-blazing.
Great, great. Speaking of that, also, we've posted the link here in the chat of your article, Angela, so folks can have access to that from the current issue. Wonderful, wonderful comments from our esteemed colleagues in the room. Last thoughts. Patty.
I just wanted to end on a note of we are living through a historic moment of monumental crisis, despair, death, and trauma. And I think that what we need more than anything is each other by any means possible. And I think it anchors our media and documentary work to remember something Louis said to me on day 2 of the quarantine. Physical distance, not social distance. Something
Yay.
my public health husband really agreed with when Louis said that. And so what I just wanted to say, and it's kind of my rallying cry, is we have to move from DIY, do it yourself, whether it is as scholars or as makers or as archivists or as, you know, film professors in film schools. And we have to move to DWO, do it with others.
Yep.
There has never been a more urgent time to do it with others. And right now, this documentary has is on the precipice between life and death. And I give a shout
note,
out.
Patty, on that
Yes.
note, we're out of
I'm
time.
done.
And I thank you for that. These are urgent times. Keep the community in media, keep the community in mind, keep yourselves well, all of you out there on this call, all of you who've been participating. This is important work. Your voices are so necessary. And I thank you for giving your time, the most precious commodity besides health we have at the moment, to this hour and a half. Keep it going. Thank you.
Thank you. All right.